Good morning. This is Kofi Bruce. I want to welcome all of our General Mills employees and the public watching this broadcast. I am the Chief Financial Officer at General Mills, and this event is part of a regular series we host called Finance Hot Topics. We generally bring in outsiders to provide some external perspective to help us learn and grow as business people. Today's event is unique, both by the caliber of the guests that we are privileged to have today, and the fact that this will be open and broadcast to the public. And our guest is wildly appropriate for the times we're in, and we are pleased to have today Neel Kashkari, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. We're going to have three segments to our discussion today. It'll be essentially a living room chat, a virtual living room chat, obviously, between Neel and I. I'm going to have him kick off in a minute or two and talk a little bit about his background in the Federal Reserve and his role. And then we'll go into a moderated session interspersed with Q&A from the public, and we will open the lines for questions to come in, which I will intersperse with some of the moderated questions. We expect to be done in roughly an hour or so. I know it's on calendar for 90 minutes, but as you can understand, Neel is busy trying to keep the financial system stable, so we want to get him back to work as soon as possible. I would say just a couple of things up the front. You know, this is a tremendous privilege for me. I'm probably maybe more as an admission of my own nerdiness, a huge fan of the Federal Reserve. I even, if you ask me, have favorite presidents of the Fed. Certainly Greenspan, Volcker, and the fact that we're able to get the Federal Reserve president of the Minneapolis Bank is quite impressive. And as Neel has been in role since January 1st of 2016, he is now actually a voting member on the Federal Open Market Committee, which actually sets rates. So he is in a position of great impact right now. He, in addition to his leadership of the bank, has been busy driving several initiatives. Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute to help improve the economic well-being of all Americans. He recently paired with Alan Page, retired justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court, on advancing public education as a fundamental right. And under Neel's leadership, the Fed has been working an action plan to end too big to fail, which, if you know anything about his background, he was heavily involved in the 2008 financial crisis. At a very young age, working at the U.S. Treasury Department under Hank Paulson, he was one of the primary architects of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was part of the federal government's response to the financial crisis. Interesting career background, which we'll explore later. Started out in aerospace engineering, so legitimately a rocket scientist, and got bored with that and went into finance and public policy, eventually earning his MBA from Wharton, going into investment banking, and then into the U.S. Treasury. A fascinating journey along the way, mostly on the policy side since he went into the public sector, but did do a brief stint as a candidate for governor of a small state out west called California in 2014. So he's obviously been a Minnesota resident since 2016. He came here with his wife, Christine, daughter, Uli, and he has three Newfoundland dogs who I am sad to say are not yet consumers of Blue Buffalo pet food. So with that, I would like to introduce Neel Kashkari.
Kofi, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you. It's a privilege. Once in a while I get invited to address a major Minnesota or major company in our region that has a lot of employees in our region. And I always jump at the chance because it's fun to get to hear directly from workers and businesses in Minnesota and give them a chance to hear directly from me. So I appreciate, Kofi, you inviting me and thank you for that. Let me just start for a few minutes and just, I imagine many of your finance staff know this, but I know that there are a broader set of folks who are watching, just to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve System and the Minneapolis Fed and what we do. So the Federal Reserve System is obviously our nation's central bank. We were created by Congress in 1913. And our basic job is to manage the ups and downs of the US economy. If the US economy looks like it's overheating, typically the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates to try to cool it down. The way that works is we raise interest rates and then it's more expensive for families to go get a mortgage to go buy a house, or to get a car loan to go buy a car, or for businesses to go raise money to go expand and invest in a new factory, for example. Or if it looks like the economy is slowing down, or we might be heading into recession, typically the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates to make it cheaper to buy a house or buy a car or to do that expansion. And so we do that to try to provide a boost to economic activity. In 1913, Congress did something unique. They said they didn't want all of the central bank just housed in the nation's capital because it might be too closely linked to politics of the day. So they said, let's break it up and let's distribute it around the country. So you've got the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. You mentioned Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, our current chair, Jay Powell. They are at the Board of Governors and they're appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. There are 7 governors total, 7 seats for governors. And then they created 12 independent Federal Reserve banks and scattered them around the country, the 9th of which is here in Minnesota, the Minneapolis Fed. And our jobs are to represent this region. That's Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, part of Michigan, and part of Wisconsin. So a big part of my job and my colleagues' jobs are to travel around the region, to learn what's happening in our local economy, what's happening to businesses, to different sectors, what's happening to wages, are people able to find jobs, are businesses able to find workers? And then when I go back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks for FOMC meetings, Federal Open Market Committee meetings, part of what I do in those meetings is I talk about what's happening here in our regional economy. Now, we can't set a different interest rate for Minnesota or for California or for New York. We all use the same dollar, so we have to set one interest rate for the whole country. But we do want to make sure that this region is represented in those deliberations so we can make the best decision we can for the country as a whole. And so that's why there is a Minneapolis Fed. Our job literally is to represent you, to represent all of the people of Minnesota and in the 9th Federal Reserve District. And then I bring that back to Washington, D.C. At the Minneapolis Fed, we have a little more than 1,000 employees. We have a brilliant team of economists who help me analyze the data. We have regional economists who travel around getting insights from businesses and from workers. And then that equips me with the information I need to make the best recommendation I can when I go back to Washington, D.C. And then, unfortunately, when a big shock hits the economy, the good news is we have a team of experts who we're able to lean on to help us sort out what does that mean for the economy. So in December, January, we were aware of COVID. We had heard of it based on what's happening around the world, what was happening in China. Our economists in Minneapolis and all across the Federal Reserve System are always looking around the world for different things that are percolating that might hit the US economy, that could affect our economic growth. So it could be trade skirmishes, it could be Brexit, which obviously has gotten a lot of attention in the UK. And we always analyze, what does that mean for the US economy? So we were aware that there was a virus in China that was starting to look more and more serious, but we didn't know how bad it would be in China and how bad it would ultimately, if it were come to America, and what it would mean for the American economy. Very quickly over the course of January and February, when it came to America, when it showed up here, all of our attention started to shift. And we started to talk to health experts to figure out, what does this likely mean for the US economy? And that's really where we've been spending the bulk of our time. In the last couple of months, the Federal Reserve has taken very aggressive action to try to provide support to the US economy. We cut interest rates effectively to zero, and then we've launched many different programs to make sure that financial markets were functioning. In March, what we saw happening was people were getting scared. Individuals were getting scared, businesses were getting scared, investors were getting scared, and there was so much uncertainty about where this virus was going and what it would mean for the US economy. People just said, we want cash, we want dollars. So you saw big businesses drawing down credit lines, not because they needed the cash tomorrow, but just out of an abundance of caution, they wanted more cash. And individuals we're going to the ATM, taking out more money, just saying, I want more cash. So one of the reasons the Federal Reserve was created to be what we call lender of last resort. When there is a panic, when people get scared and they just want cash, it's very hard for the banking system by themselves to provide all that cash if all of their customers are demanding cash at the same time. That's where the central bank steps in. So we acted very aggressively to provide liquidity to the financial markets in the form of cash, physical cash to banks to meet your ATM needs, but also lending the banks different facilities to make sure that there's enough liquidity in financial markets on the order of trillions of dollars. And that action was very aggressive, and it worked. And it provided the liquidity to provide stability to financial markets, make sure the financial markets were functioning. You know, an analogy that I use is that this is a healthcare crisis, and I know we're going to talk more about it, so I won't go on too long here. This is a healthcare crisis that had the potential to infect other segments of the economy. So, you know, all of us, I go grocery shopping for my family. So I go once a week or every 2 weeks. And I joke with Kofi in advance and before this call that, you know, my wife will send me with a long list of things she wants to buy, and then I supplement that list with some of my own additions. So speaking of General Mills, I'm a lifelong consumer of Totino's pizza rolls, which she's learned to enjoy, maybe not as much as I do. And then more recently, I introduced her to Hamburger Helper, which went over very well, by the way, on Sunday night with my wife. I made it, and our daughter. But just so General Mills is doing good business because Americans are going to the grocery store a lot more, and we're grateful that the food supply chain, it's not perfect. There are challenges, but there is food in the grocery store. That's so important to the country. But imagine if General Mills, whose business is not directly harmed by the crisis, imagine if you were unable to raise money in the capital markets to fund your core operations. That is how this virus could infect other sectors of the US economy. And that's why it was so important that we took the action that we took to make sure that the capital markets are functioning so that businesses like General Mills are able to access the capital that you need to continue to fund your operations, to continue to provide food for the American people. And so that's why I do think, you know, we're not the first responders in this crisis. The first responders are the doctors and the nurses and the health scientists. But the Federal Reserve does have an important role to play to make sure that the capital markets are functioning and there's basic liquidity so that General Mills and other companies are able to access them to continue to operate, because we need you to operate. So look, I can go on and on about the crisis, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but thank you for having me, Kofi. Why don't I turn it back over to you and we can have the discussion.
Oh, beautiful. And I think why don't we start there? I think it's clear that this is a generation altering event that we've got going on in the background with the pandemic. And the question I would ask, just based upon your front row seat in the last great financial crisis, the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, how is this different from a macroeconomic perspective than the last crisis? So what lessons from the last crisis that you brought forward are really useful, and kind of what are the limits of those in this environment?
Well, one is obviously the last crisis was a housing related financial crisis. The epicenter were in banks, the housing market, the mortgage market. And in that case, Treasury, I was at Treasury, and the Federal Reserve were the first responders. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're not the first responders. This is fundamentally a healthcare crisis. What determines the path of the economy now is the path of the virus. And so anything our healthcare system can do to speed up development of vaccines or therapies or massive testing so that we have confidence that it's safe to go back out to restaurants and movie theaters, et cetera, that's what's going to determine how our economy grows. So this is, in a sense, what's happening now is a natural disaster, but it's hitting the entire US economy at the same time. So back then, one of the things we all worried a lot about was moral hazard. People, individuals, banks, investors took big risks. And now if we run to the rescue, we're going to be encouraging them to take foolish risks in the future. That's not this case. In this case, the restaurants and the airlines and the hotels were not taking foolish risks. They were operating their businesses the way they always have. And then this natural disaster effectively hit the US economy. So That's a fundamental difference. Another one is scale. As big as the Great Recession was, as big as that financial crisis was, it was really focused on the financial markets, the housing sector, banking. This is almost like a hurricane hitting the U.S., the entire country at the same time. And that's the scale of it is even bigger, which is hard to fathom, but it is even bigger than that. There are some important lessons. First is, and I think we're taking these lessons to heart. First is we were always, in retrospect, slow to respond to the 2008 crisis because we didn't know how bad it was going to get, and we didn't want to overreact. And at every step, we thought, well, we've done this thing. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we'll get through it now. And then it just got worse, and it got worse. And then we had to do more, and we had to do more. So we were always playing catch up. In hindsight, the right thing to do would have been to overreact. Just put massive fiscal and monetary support behind the economy to try to make that Great Recession less great. Well, I think we learned that lesson, and certainly the Federal Reserve and Congress. I mean, the Federal Reserve has acted with breathtaking speed, much more aggressively than we acted in 08, and I think that was the right thing to do, and we're seeing the benefits of that in the stability of financial markets and the basic functioning of markets. And Congress, to their great credit, has already put forward around $3 trillion of support to the economy, to businesses, and to workers. And I would expect they're likely to do more. They're already debating, what more do they want to do? So I think the breathtaking speed of the policy response is a real benefit from the lesson that we had in 2008. And the last thing I'll say is, in 2008, because there was this issue of moral hazard, people were really angry. Think about housing. A lot of people said, well, my neighbor was irresponsible. He bought a house he never should have. You better not bail that guy out. He doesn't deserve it. So we, both in the Bush and the Obama administration, tried to design a bunch of mortgage programs to help homeowners, but we tried to design them to help homeowners who only needed a little bit of assistance because we didn't want to bail out the irresponsible. Well, it turned out when we designed these programs to help, to be very targeted, we didn't help very many people, and our help was slow. And I think arguably the downturn was more severe than maybe it needed to be because we were trying to be targeted in our assistance. In a sense, we were penny wise and pound foolish. I think now Congress is being much more aggressive and saying, let's help as many small businesses as we can. Let's not worry about who's deserving and who's not. Let's help as many as we can because the economy will be better for it. But I'll just say, we're already seeing the blowback. We're seeing the press stories. The press can't help themselves to go say, well, this business was not deserving, and it gets a lot of clicks, but it really hurts us in terms of our ability to get the economy through this. The more we play gotcha and say this person wasn't deserving and that person wasn't deserving, it directly works against the effectiveness of our programs. And I don't know in a democracy how to do anything about that. It's human nature, that gotcha, but it's a challenge.
Yeah, I would say just from the other side of this, that the policy response has been swift from the Fed, and at a time when institutions themselves are maybe under question and suspicion. I would say the Fed has uniquely risen above both politics to focus on the policy implications of the present environment. So I want to pick up on your point about moral hazard. And as you think about this environment, you've talked about the risks of bankruptcy, because I think to your point about stories being picked up, whether you've got your sectors like travel, airlines, and people might say, well, shouldn't we just let some of these businesses and frankly these sectors go bankrupt, right? I mean, that's what bankruptcy laws are for. You've warned about some of the risks of that, which are the loss of productive capacity. And then on the other side, there's a moral hazard question about, okay, well, maybe what's the responsibility of companies to keep their balance sheet strong enough to withstand these types of shocks? So I'd love for you to explore that concept a little further.
Well, there's no question bankruptcy is a critical, vital part of a capitalist system. It's part of the way you reallocate capital and you let more efficient, more innovative companies thrive by letting their competitors who fail go out of business. But I would just say it's a different scenario when the economy overall is strong, and through market forces, a company loses and goes through bankruptcy. I mean, that's absolutely, we need to have that. That's vital to our economic system and our competitiveness. I would say it's different when a natural disaster strikes and risk, toppling an entire industry. I mean, I'm as frustrated as anybody in that it just seems like anytime there's any kind of economic shock, whether it was 9/11 or 2008 or now this COVID crisis, the airline industry is, on a knife's edge. Why is it always
Right.
the airline industry
Right.
that's always getting into trouble? And I think, we should have that debate and understand it. But clearly we do need airlines.
Right.
Clearly we do need the ability to travel internationally and travel around the country. So simply saying, well, we're going to let the entire airline industry go under probably doesn't make economic sense for our nation's economic future. It's like in 2008, there was some consolidation, there was some downsizing or rationalizing of the auto industry. When these shocks happen, I think that often does lead to some shrinking or some consolidation in industries. But does it lead to enough? I don't know.
Yeah.
So these are complicated questions, but bankruptcy is clearly part of the capitalist economic system that we have. It's just a different thing when the shock is hitting the entire country at the same time.
Right. So this would be different than sort of the normal creative forces of destruction that would, in a capitalist environment, and to your point, allocate capital efficiently. Hey, I want to pick up on some of the audience questions. So one of the things that the audience is asking is, how do the economic impacts of COVID-19 that we're experiencing here in Minnesota compare to other regions in the U.S. as you talk to your peer presidents of the other districts?
I think it's quite similar. I mean, one of the things about our region here, it really does look like the U.S. economy as a whole, because we have most major sectors of the U.S. economy represented here in relative size. And we've got manufacturing, obviously ag and food. We've got healthcare in size. We've got mining. We've got services and technology. So our region, really does look like the U.S. economy as a whole. So then what ends up happening to the U.S. economy ends up happening to our region. One thing that's different that we're paying a lot of attention to, cases are still climbing in Minnesota. Hospitalizations are still climbing in Minnesota. We still have a lot of people in the ICU, and we still have a lot of people for our size relatively dying. And so, I'm cautious about what the road ahead looks like here in Minnesota and what it means for our employees at the Minneapolis Fed and your employees at General Mills. I mean, I think we all need to be watching this data very carefully. We are seeing regional differences in how the virus is progressing. Some people say, well, maybe there's a seasonality to this. Maybe as it gets warmer, you're going to see caseload start to diminish. But then the same people say, or same health experts say, don't be lulled into a false sense of security because it may come raging back in the fall. So, there are regional differences just in how the virus is spreading, which may be partially due to temperature and local climates. And then there are also the policy responses. So I would say Minnesota right now looks like the United States as a whole, rather than saying it looks like California or it looks like Florida or it looks like New York. And we obviously have our hotspots within Minnesota as well.
Makes a ton of sense. Well, let me pick up on the last point you were alluding to around the health crisis itself. And as you think about the economic scenarios that are going to come, I think most projections would have us going into some degree of recession, order of magnitude, potentially 2x or more, the size of unemployment, certainly GDP contraction that we saw in 2008. What would we expect in terms of the length of the recovery? Are you kind of where Jay Powell is in terms of, I think yesterday he indicated maybe 2021. What's your thinking on expectations around what a recovery might look like?
I mean, it really is, and I agree with the chairman's comments. It really does determine. It's going to be determined by the virus. The end point of all of this is either we have a effective vaccine, or we have an effective therapy, or eventually we reach something called herd immunity, where 60 to 70% of the people would have had the disease, and most of whom would have recovered. Though achieving herd immunity organically could be very, very costly in terms of loss of life and people getting sick and having health consequences. Those are the ultimate destinations. And so I always ask people, what is it going to take for you to feel safe taking your family to the movies?
Mhm.
I mean, if we're talking about when do we get back to what life was like in January, that's what I mean. I would go to the movies in January. I mean, we had a little one at home, so I didn't. But otherwise, going to the movies, sure. Going out to dinner, sure.
Right.
What's it going to take to really get back to normal? The health experts say it's 18 months to 2 years before we reach one of those destinations at scale. And so that means if that's right, now there could be a breakthrough sooner. That'd be wonderful. And then we could get back to normal sooner. But assuming it's 18 months or 2 years away, then we're on a measured recovery. And my view is there are going to be regional variations in how we open up, and there are going to be business by business variations in how we open up. So Minneapolis Fed, 95% of our staff are working from home. The 5% who are there, we're able to socially distance within the operations. We're able to put in place safety measures, but not all businesses can do that. Movie theaters can't do that. You hear restaurants saying, well, we'll reopen with half as many tables. That sounds promising, but can they cover their costs with half as many customers? I don't know. Probably not.
Right.
And so unfortunately, I think it's going to be in a business by business basis. And that means whenever we hit the bottom, whether it's June or it's July, the recovery is going to be more muted until we finally get to one of those destinations when hopefully we can then get back to normal fairly quickly. And so I agree, it's probably a year or two away before we really start seeing strong economic growth. I mean, we'll have growth from this low base, but really getting back to what the economy was like, I agree with the chairman.
Yeah. And so you're definitely not a V-shaped recovery prognosticator.
A couple months ago, I was hopeful that maybe we'd have a quick, an aggressive lockdown, clamp down on the virus, snuff it out, then we can turn things back on. We clamped down, we didn't snuff it out.
Yeah.
It's still spreading and millions of people have it.
Well, we're getting some great questions from the audience, so I want to be respectful of those. Let me ask this one from the audience. So, question is: some economists posit that the Fed's actions may have exacerbated some disjointedness between what they call the real economy and the Wall Street economy. Specifically, that pumping all this liquidity into the market has calmed the financial markets, maybe stabilized asset prices, and in some level maybe juiced them a bit. So the question is, how do you think about whether or not this drives income inequality or further disparity between the Main Street and the Wall Street economy?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question that I would get a lot even before the COVID crisis.
I'll bet.
And it's a fair question. And I would just ask, what's the alternative? If we allowed the financial markets to collapse and allowed companies like General Mills not to be able to fund themselves, would the American people be better off? Would the very people that you're worried about and that we're worried about? This virus, by the way, is targeting lowest income Americans. Because Kofi, you're working from home, I'm working from home. We're not that affected.
Right.
But the people who are directly affected are the folks in the roles, the frontline service workers who don't have this option to do this. And so the virus is deeply unfair. I mean, deeply unfair. But if we had allowed the financial markets to seize up and not function, how would we be helping them? And so it's a good question. But setting aside the COVID crisis, longer term, I get this question too. And I would just say this: when we had low interest rates and accommodative monetary policy, we were trying to stimulate job growth. And it took 10 years to rebuild the labor market to where it was before the 2008 financial crisis. 10 years. And only at the end of the expansion were we starting to see wage gains for lower end workers. And it's long overdue, and they were really deserving of those wage gains. If we had raised interest rates just to try to clamp down on Wall Street, we would have been clamping down on the wages and the job growth of those lower income Americans. And I always ask, how would we be helping them if we're limiting their job opportunities and limiting their wage growth? And so these are complicated questions. We have this one tool of monetary policy. there are multiple tools, but one tool of monetary policy that has all these different effects. If we're really just trying to focus on what's best for low-income Americans, if it boosts Wall Street but it helps low-income Americans, that to me feels like the right trade. I'd rather do that than punish low-income Americans for the sake of trying to clamp down on Wall Street.
That makes a ton of sense. As you think about, you've taken some unprecedented actions. We're effectively at zero interest rates. Now, monetary policy, if I can be candid from my perspective and one person's humble opinion, has been the one part of our tool set that has been used effectively and maybe overused in the absence of fiscal policy. So the question I would ask is, Jay Powell just recently said that you were not out of dry powder. So what else is still on the table, and should we be worried about you running out of leverage now that rates are effectively at zero?
Well, and he's also said very clearly that we have an infinite ability to lend.
Sure.
We have, what makes a central bank powerful is that the Parliament or the Congress grants the central bank the unique authority to create money, and we can lend that money out, but we can't grant it out. We can't say to Americans, here's $500 to each American. We can only make loans. And so we're not out of dry powder in our ability to lend. But for a lot of people, they don't need a loan.
Mm-hmm.
They need cash. They need they need money, they need a grant. And only Congress can do that. So he's right, and I agree with him that we have a lot more ability to loan money at attractive rates to businesses to keep markets moving and to keep businesses financed. But a lot of businesses and a lot of individuals, especially those who've lost their jobs, just need cash in their pockets to pay their bills. And only Congress and the executive branch have the ability to do that. And one of the best pieces of the news in this whole crisis is how Congress put politics aside and came together and said, we're going to stand behind the American people, the American economy with swift, incredibly bold action. I mean, $3 trillion is no joke how quickly they moved to pass that. And there are deliberations on doing more. And so, think about the 20 or 30 million Americans who've lost their jobs. They got to pay rent.
Mm-hmm.
They got to pay their mortgage. They got to put food on the table for their families, and giving them a loan isn't going to help. And so that's why the checks that Congress has authorized, the enhanced unemployment benefits, et cetera, those have been so important. And if this goes on for a long period of time, if it goes on elevated unemployment for a year or two, those workers are going to need more assistance. And that's where the Fed is not equipped to do that. Only Congress is equipped to do that.
I want to pick up on that point. I know this isn't directly, obviously, in your charter, but one of the things that I'm keenly aware of is we come into this crisis with a structural deficit on the fiscal side, so Congress's purview, of a little over $1 trillion, and then the PPP and the additional support for the economy adds another $3 trillion. So we'll have about a $4 trillion deficit, all of which is adding to the federal debt, which at this point is well north of 25 trillion potentially if you include the intergovernmental holdings. So the debate that's raging as Congress looks at the next round is probably going to continue to butt up against the question of how far should the government go, when should we worry about the fiscal indebtedness, and start thinking about the policy balance between budgets and deficit spending. Any perspective on that from a banker's chair of now's not the right time? Is it 2 years from now, and should we be worried about this as citizens?
Eventually, we have to. We're going to pay our obligations, and we're going to pay our liabilities, and the bill is going to come due. And it'll get paid for through a combination of growth and taxes and potential spending cuts. And if you forecast out the U.S. government's debt, even absent the COVID crisis, over the next 30 years, it goes up like this. And that's because of programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And most of those programs are funded by current workers paying for current retirees. And yet we're having fewer children. Our society is aging, as is true in most advanced economies. So those ratios are going imbalanced. And so you make up the difference by issuing more debt. That's not sustainable. At some point, we have to address that. Right now, we have extraordinary fiscal capacity to borrow and spend what we need to get through this crisis. And the evidence of that is that the US government, even with all of this borrowing, even with all of this $3 trillion of unexpected spending that we didn't expect 3 months ago, now we just, Congress has allocated another $3 trillion. Treasury's borrowing at very, very, very low rates, 10-year, sub 1%, 0.6%, 0.7%. So investors around the world are saying they have great confidence that if the US government has the capacity to bear this debt and eventually pay off this debt. And they've got great confidence, even as, as dysfunctional as our politics seems, we do come together in times of crisis, and we do come together to do big things, even though it doesn't seem like it, but we do once in a while. And they're voting that, hey, the US government and the US political system will come together to deal with this fiscal problem. And so now is not the time to say, let's be cautious with what we're spending. I think we do need to spend what is necessary to support the American people and the American healthcare system, especially through this crisis. But eventually we will have to get our fiscal house in order. And that means addressing the very real political questions of how do you put these entitlement programs into balance, given where our demographics are going.
Good. Well, one question from the audience here. I know Jerome Powell's been pretty candid and clear on this point, but is there a scenario in which negative interest rates would be an effective monetary response? And I think at the back of this, should we worry about maybe the malaise that beset, a country like Japan, where, they had a good almost 2 decades of no growth and effectively zero interest rates?
Yeah, so we've, I think all the members of the Federal Open Market Committee have said, I don't know anybody who's completely ruled it out and said never, it's impossible. But I think all of us believe that there are other tools that we would use before we would consider going negative. So let's just spend a moment on this. The interest rate that gets a lot of attention is the federal funds rate that we've set effectively at 0. It's an overnight interest rate that banks charge each other. Well, you as CFO of General Mills don't really care about overnight interest rates. You care about interest rates that are concurrent with your business horizon. If you're going to invest, you're going to expand over the next 5 years or next 10 years, you care about what interest rates are going to be for the next 5 or 10 years. Well, why do we move overnight interest rates up and down? We move them up and down effectively because they can affect long rates. And that's a tool we use to affect long rates. But it's those long rates that actually drive economic activity. So we've moved short rates down effectively to 0. Does that mean we're out of ammunition to move long rates? No. One thing we can do is we can use quantitative easing by buying long-term bonds to directly drive down long-term rates. And the second tool we have is what we call forward guidance. If I told you, hypothetically, that we commit to hold the overnight rate at 0 for the next 10 years, the 10-year rate will be pretty close to 0 if we were to hypothetically make that kind of commitment. So just by the words that we use and the strength of our commitment, we can affect long rates. So we have these other tools that we have more experience using now because we used them in 08 and 09 that we could still deploy if we needed to try to have a bigger effect on long rates. I don't want to say never to going negative on the short rate, because imagine if there was some economic scenario where long rates on their own went to 0.
Yep.
You might argue that for structural reasons, you want some positive slope to the yield curve. Then in that scenario, maybe one can argue you might want to bring the overnight rate down to slightly negative just to give a positive slope to the yield curve. So I don't want to say no, never, but it's not likely. And there are other tools we would use first. Then to Japan. Japan, I talked about the demographics of the US. Japan's demographics are much worse. And they basically have a shrinking workforce. And it's hard to solve a demographic problem with monetary policy. The one advantage that we have that Japan does not have, one is our society is not aging as rapidly as theirs is, but we also have immigration. And immigration has been a very powerful force of economic growth for America over our history. Many immigrants around the world want to come to America. My parents came here. You, Kofi, you're immigrant family.
Yep.
My wife's is an immigrant. So there's a lot of draw of immigrants wanting to come to America. And that's a huge economic advantage we have that Japan does not have, because culturally they're very averse to immigration. And so I don't see us following the path of Japan because we have these real advantages, which make a huge difference.
But that's reassuring to hear. So what I want to pick up on that last point and maybe switch gears a little bit here. Won't promise not to come back to the present crisis and questions around that. But as you alluded to, you're the child of immigrants, so a first generation American, and how did that shape your career development, your aspirations early on? That your early career development and move into aerospace engineering, and then the somewhat strange either drift or big career shift to banking.
Yeah. Well, it was a pretty typical immigrant household. My parents put a huge emphasis on education. Growing up in our house, there were two choices: doctor or engineer. And my sister became a doctor. I went the engineering route. And then, I loved engineering. I absolutely loved it. I was deep into R&D in the bowels of a research lab, and my managers were encouraging me to get my PhD. And I knew if I got my PhD, I would really be making a lifelong commitment to R&D. And as much as I loved it, I wasn't ready to make that type of a commitment. So I said, let me go to business school and just learn something about business and finance. Who knows what it'll lead to? And then it kind of, one of the things in business school, as soon as you get to business school, you start recruiting. And I said, well, how can I start applying for jobs? I don't even know what these jobs are. And, in my household, it was doctor or engineer. When you get to business school, it's banker or consultant. And so very quickly, I had to make a choice, banking or consulting. And so it's, not for very good reasons. I went into investment banking, just following herds. And, but in the back of my mind, I always had this interest in public policies. So it worked out okay.
Well, let's talk about that. I think you've got a very interesting story about mentors and the value of following your ambition. So you're a vice president at Goldman Sachs. I'd be interested to know how you made that transition to move to the U.S. Treasury Department when Hank Paulson left Goldman Sachs.
So I'll give you the short story is I'd always had an interest in government. And I'd met Paulson once. He was in New York, of course. I was in San Francisco. I was at West doing tech banking. I met him once for 10 minutes. When he got announced to be Treasury Secretary, I basically cold called him and said, I want to come with you. I don't care if you want me to lick envelopes. I just want to serve. And he's like, who is this guy? And he made some calls to senior partners who knew me, and they gave me good references. And I ended up starting with him the day he started. And people at Goldman, my managers, many of them thought I was crazy because I was doing very well. I was early in my career. I still had $100,000 of student loans to pay off. They're like, you're going to give up your great career at Goldman to go be an aide to the Treasury Secretary at the end of the Bush administration? What's the matter with you? And I said, what's the matter with you? This is a once in a lifetime chance to get to serve. I'll learn something. And the worst thing that happens is I don't like it and I go back and maybe I can't come back to Goldman, but I get another job. I'll learn a ton. And so I think my interest in service and my curiosity was genuine. And I'm probably I may be the only person who called up Hank Paulson and said, I want to come work with you. I don't care if you want me to lick envelopes. And he's told me because my interest was genuine is what was important to make me effective when I was there.
You certainly
a big job. I just wanted that chance.
Well, you certainly couldn't have predicted what was to come, right? That you would
Agreed.
be working through one of the biggest financial crises of a generation, and touching on that, I think clearly you had probably some early signs. It'd be interesting for the audience to hear a little bit about what that was like on the inside as the financial crisis was unfolding, and how you moved to action. And ultimately you were clearly recognized. You won an Alexander Hamilton Award, which is I understand almost as hard to secure as tickets to the musical. So you clearly had an impact in a time of crisis. It'd be great to hear a little bit about that inside story.
Well, it was it started, so we got there July of 06. And one of the first things Paulson did is he had a group of us work with a group at the Fed and the SEC. He said literally in '06, we're due for some kind of crisis. Markets and the economy have been stable. Go do some scenario planning on what it might be. We looked at a lot of scenarios, a big bank running, oil shocks, hedge funds blowing up. Honestly, we didn't look at a nationwide housing collapse.
Right.
Never occurred to us. And, so we missed it. In a year later, in July of '07, we started seeing the first rumblings of housing coming under pressure, some hedge funds coming into pressure. And then we didn't know, again, we just didn't know how serious it was going to get. You just never know at the beginning of a crisis. Is this a 1 in 10 year event? Is this a 100-year event? And you're having to make decisions with this not being able to see the future. And you don't want to be, at the time, you don't want to be the one saying, oh, this is, we're crying wolf, the sky is falling, we need to do everything, we need to break the glass and pull the fire alarm. And so it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I remember it was January '08, Secretary Paulson had a call with former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, and we were all huddled around the Secretary's speakerphone on his desk. And, Alan Greenspan speaks in a very quiet voice, and he said, this might be a 1 in 100-year event. And that, it shocked me. Really? This might be a 1 in 100-year event. What are we going to do? And that's when we started doing the scenario planning of, if we had to go to Congress to ask for authority to bail out the financial system, what would it be? What would it look like? And that's when we started the early work, conceptual work of what later became the TARP program. So we had a wonderful team. Paulson had assembled a wonderful team. And I think he and Chairman Bernanke worked very well together. And we leaned a lot on staff at the Board of Governors and the New York Fed. And, it was not about politics. It was just, what do we need to do to get through this? And I'm proud to be associated with all those folks. We had really good people together.
Well, it certainly was impressive from a policy standpoint in that there were elements of the response that partisans on every side could hate. But at the end of the day, I think what I always admired from the outside was the way in which you stayed focused on solving the problem. There's a really good question here from the audience. Just first, admiration for the fact that you did this, took this task on, and you were probably in your mid-30s at that point, and you had a budget of maybe 700 billion or so or more working TARP. And then a few years later, you went from the policy side and actually took a run, a pretty close to successful run, I might add, for governor of California. They're interested to know kind of who were some of your career influences and mentors who helped shape you along the way, and what's the best piece of advice you've gotten along the way that helped you in your development?
Well, I ran for governor for the same reason I joined the Minneapolis Fed, is because I care deeply about public policy, and I saw firsthand in '08 what a huge difference public policy makes, for better or worse, to people, to the country, to people's lives. I always say, if you want to help 1,000 people, donate to a charity. If you want to help 1 million people or 10 million people or 100 million people, you can only do that through the public policy, because it works at that scale. And so that's why I ran for governor. And my campaign was totally focused on economic issues. It was a campaign of economic opportunity. And so I feel like it's totally consistent with kind of the thread of Treasury, running for office, and now at the Fed. In terms of my mentors, I've had the privilege of working for really good managers in almost all cases throughout my career, who always encouraged me to take on big, ambitious challenges and supported me to do that. My manager that I worked for, the partner I worked for at Goldman, when I was pitching Hank Paulson to take me, some other people were questioning it. He was incredibly supportive. He's like, I hate to lose you, but this is a great opportunity for you. You'll learn a ton, and I'll support you any way that I can. I think the best mentors and managers were the ones that supported you, recognizing that supporting you may not be in their own narrow short-term interest, but recognize it's good for you over the long term. And so I really value that. I also have become dear friends, and I really value my relationship with Secretary Paulson. He gave me a shot when I was a kid. I started working for him when I was 32, and he's like, "Who is this kid?" And he gave me some projects that were not core to see what I could do, and I did well, and then he gave me more, and he gave me more, and he gave me more. And I really admire the way he and Bernanke conducted themselves during the crisis. I mean, it really was, how do we address the problem? Just get all the good ideas on the table. Let's figure them out. Let's try everything and just keep driving forward. And so I've had the privilege of working with some very good people that I've learned from. And you don't completely emulate somebody else. You take pieces from what you see them doing effectively, and you stitch together your own toolkit. More recently, I've gotten to know quite well former Justice Alan Page. And boy, the more time I spend with him, the more I just admire him. And I just hope that just a little bit of his wisdom and his grace can rub off on me, because the guy is just, he's one in a million.
He's quite an impressive guy. Well, one of the things that I want to pull on is, you and I obviously share a background as first generation Americans, and maybe keenly appreciate the value of education in our upbringing. And that's also an area where your personal passion and community work is. So I'd love to hear you just talk about why it's important. What are some of the places where you invest your personal time as well as your professional capital to advance the cause?
Well, for me, and I imagine you will say the same thing. I mean, I look at my own professional success. This is an amazing country that kind of the random son of immigrants could get to have the opportunity that you've had, that I've had. What's enabled it? You got to get a good education. That's the key to unlocking all of the doors of opportunity in our country. And our country is not perfect, but if you get that education, you will likely have a lot of wonderful opportunities that you can pursue. But you got to get that education. And I just think it's devastating that too many American kids are not getting the education that I benefited from growing up. And I think it's unfair. And so I don't, just getting on a philosophical moment, I don't believe in guaranteeing equality of outcomes, but we sure as hell should guarantee equality of opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so that starts with education. And so that's why there's nowhere I want to spend more of my time than if I can, than helping other kids of all backgrounds get access to a good education to open those doors of opportunity. It'll be good for them. It'll be good for their communities. It'll be good for our nation. I mean, imagine a nation. Imagine if our country truly educated all of our children. Mm-hmm. Imagine how productive and how much we could generate as a country if we didn't leave behind millions of kids and not tap into their potential. I just think it's a tragedy that's avoidable. And so I want to do whatever I can to try to avoid that and empower those kids.
No, it's certainly a great cause, and I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of education and advancing opportunity. Well, I'm going to switch gears back to the economy. One of the questions we have from the audience is, it really touches on deflation, inflation, and what would you expect to be sort of the immediate or echoing impact of the economic environment that follows our sort of period of social isolation? Do you expect deflation to be more of a focus area, and what can the Fed do about it if that risk comes?
Well, I think in the near term, for the next couple of years, low inflation is a much bigger risk than high inflation. Even with, typically when governments borrow a lot and spend a lot, mm-hmm. the risk is it leads to inflation. But if you look at measures of inflation and inflation expectations, they're trending down, they're not trending up. And so right now, most people are expecting lower inflation. Deflation, I don't want to say there's no risk of that. I think we would act very, very aggressively. Again, our lending authorities are unconstrained, so we can put out as much liquidity into the economy as we need to stave off a deflation scenario. So I'm not that worried about that. And I'm not worried about high inflation in the near term. Once we get through this crisis, I mean, that speaks back to our earlier conversation about eventually getting our fiscal house in order and addressing these structural deficits. That's where, over the long run, inflation could be a concern. But even there, I mean, the Federal Reserve knows how to contain inflation. We can always raise interest rates to bottle up inflation, but there are costs associated with that. And so the key is, how do we get our spending on a more sustainable trajectory so that the Fed does not have to come in with very high rates to cap inflation, the way Paul Volcker did it so effectively back around 1980.
Yep. Great. Well, we're running short on time, so I'm going to give you one more question, and then we'll wrap and thank you for your time. So you mentioned scenario planning, and that was a big part of some of the early preparation for that ultimately got you ready to respond to TARP. So let's say you're CFO of General Mills. What kind of scenarios would you be thinking about modeling in this environment? Asking for a friend.
I would look at what are we doing and what am I doing? I'll just tell you, we're looking at different scenarios for the virus. So I'll give you an example. There's a epidemiologist expert that I've been spending a lot of time with lately named Mike Osterholm at the University of Minnesota. His group, CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, has started putting out short papers on where the virus may go. And they have three different scenarios for the virus. One is kind of little peaks that, not little, medium peaks that we just experienced in March and April that could continue until we achieve one of these destinations. Another one is a giant spike in the fall, like the flu pandemic in 1918. The flu pandemic in 1918, it emerged in the spring, it went dormant over the summer, people thought they were through it, and then it came raging back in the fall, and the real devastation was caused in the fall. And then the third scenario is kind of a gradual burnout, which is the best case scenario. So I'm looking at those scenarios and saying, what could that mean for the economy? So if I were CFO of a big business, a global business, I would look at those kinds of scenarios and say, what do I think that means for our business? And General Mills, obviously being a global company, you're probably going to have different regions experiencing very different things at different times. And so China obviously experienced, and I chatted with your CEO and others to understand what was happening in China. What were you seeing that helped inform me of what might be coming here? And then watching China, there's some reports that it's flaring back up again in some places. Are they having to clamp things back down? So I guess I would look geographically at where are these different geographies in their stage of the virus, and then what are their own forecasts, and what does that mean for what's going to happen here domestically? So a lot of scenarios, I guess.
No, we're living in scenario land. So look, I want to thank you for your generosity with your time. I know you're incredibly busy, but certainly on behalf of General Mills, we appreciate the service you're doing to the region and the community. And I think you've been a tremendous source of information for us as we're navigating this unprecedented period. So keep it going, and appreciate the hard work that you put in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks for everything General Mills does to keep our grocery store stocked. You know, I'm not kidding. It's really important. When Italy was under full lockdown, the first question I had is there food in the grocery stores? Right. And there was, thankfully. And that was key to them getting through it. So don't lose sight of how important your work is to helping the country get through this.
Appreciate you recognizing that on behalf of all the General Mills employees working the front lines in our production and in our businesses. Thanks, Neel.
All right, good to see you. Thank you.
Okay, take care.